Imagine for a moment a place without straight lines. Seriously, paths weren't straight, huts were round, life flowed like a river, not a highway. This was my great-great-grandmother's world, a world before the maps with sharp, angry borders were drawn. In her village, wealth wasn't about what you owned, but who you knew. Your family, your neighbors, people you could count on when the rains were late, people you could count on when a lion was feeling particularly bold. That was your bank account. It was a system built on relationships, not receipts. The land didn't belong to one person. It belonged to everyone and no one. A sacred trust passed down from the ancestors. Life wasn't perfect, you understand. Arguments, droughts, problems. But they were our problems, to be solved our way. The sun, the seasons, not by a clock on a wall. Then one day, the ships came. At first, they were just a curiosity on the horizon. My ancestors probably watched them, wondering what strange giant birds were floating on the water. The people who came off those ships were different. Their skin was pale, their hair was strange, and their clothes were, well, let's just say they weren't designed for the African sun. They brought shiny things, mirrors, beads, guns, and for a while it was about trade. It seemed like a new, interesting relationship, but soon the nature of the visit changed. The guests decided they weren't guests anymore. They decided they were the new owners of the house. Suddenly, the world was flipped upside down. The things that mattered before, community, tradition, the wisdom of the elders, were now seen as backward, primitive. The strangers brought a new god, a new language, and a new way of seeing the world where everything could be bought and sold. They said our gods were demons and our traditions were savage. They built churches on sacred ground and schools where they taught our children that their own culture was something to be ashamed of. A child who once learned history from the village storyteller now learned about kings and queens in a cold, distant land they would never see. One of the first things the new landlords did was take the land. The very concept of selling land was foreign in many countries. It was like for the sky. But the colonizers came with pieces of paper treaties and deeds often misunderstood or signed under duress. A local leader might think he was agreeing to share the land for farming only to find out he had sold it forever. Trees, the water, the ground underneath. Suddenly, communities that had farmed a piece of land for generations were told they were squatters. They were forced off the most fertile ground, which was then turned into huge plantations. Coffee, cocoa, rubber, crops not to feed Africans, but to be shipped back to Europe. With the land gone, the resource grab began. Africa is rich: gold, diamonds, copper, oil. The colonizers saw a giant treasure chest and brought the biggest shovels. They extracted resources with astonishing efficiency using African labor, while nearly all the profits flowed back to colonial powers. Mines were dug. Railways were built, but railways connected the resource-rich interior to the ports, not cities to cities. One-way tracks, designed to get Africa's wealth out as quickly as possible. They introduced taxis, hot taxis, poll taxis, and the only way to pay was to work for the colonizers in their mines, on their plantations, as servants in their homes. Perhaps the most absurd and damaging thing colonialism did was to draw lines on a map. In 1884, a group of powerful European men gathered in Berlin. They sat around a table with a map of Africa, a place most of them had never been to, and they carved it up like a cake. With rulers and pencils, they drew straight lines through deserts, across rivers, and over mountains, completely ignoring the people who actually lived there. They weren't creating countries, they were creating claims. This piece is for Belgium, that part is for Britain, France can have this chunk over here. It was the ultimate act of arrogance, deciding the fate of millions from thousands of miles away. These new artificial borders were a disaster. Imagine someone drawing a line straight through your house. Suddenly, your kitchen is in one country and your bedroom is in another. That's exactly what happened to entire ethnic groups. Communities that had coexisted for centuries were suddenly split between two, sometimes three. People were cut off from their relatives, their sacred sites, and their traditional grazing lands. You might need a passport issued by a Frenchman to visit your cousin who lives just on the other side of the river, a river you've crossed your whole life without a second thought. This created a profound sense of dislocation and broke apart societies that had been whole for generations. At the same time, the colonizers threw rival groups together into the same administrative unit. The favoritism shown to the Tutsi in Rwanda by the Belgians is a tragic example of how this policy planted the seeds of future conflict and genocide. The colonial powers didn't just take Africa's resources, they rewired its economies to serve their own needs. Before they arrived, most African societies had diverse local economies. People grew a variety of crops to feed themselves and produce goods for local trade. But the colonizers changed all that. They forced a shift to a monoculture economy. Regions were made to specialize in one or two cash crops, cocoa in Ghana, cotton in Sudan, all for export. That made colonies dependent on the global market. The structure was designed to stop Africa building its own industries. Why would Britain want colonial textile factories when it could sell textiles made in Manchester from cotton grown in Egypt? Local industries were discouraged or couldn't compete with cheap European goods. Africa exported raw materials for low prices and imported expensive manufactured goods. It's a classic trap. You sell raw cocoa beans for $1 and buy back a chocolate bar for $10. Value and profits were added elsewhere. At independence, new nations inherited these broken economies. They kept exporting raw materials and importing finished products. They lacked factories, they lacked technology, and they lacked capital. They were still playing by rules written for someone else. This dependency is one of colonialism's most enduring legacies, is why resource-rich countries still face poverty and debt. The ghosts of colonialism are not just in our economies or our politics, they are inside our heads. Colonialism taught a generation of Africans that they were inferior. It taught them that their languages were unsophisticated, their religions were pagan, their skin color was a mark of shame. This created a deep-seated psychological wound and inferiority complex that can take generations to heal. For a long time, success was measured by how well you could imitate the colonizer. Speaking English, speaking French, adopting European dress. Our own beautiful, diverse cultures were pushed into the background. This cultural loss is immense. We lost languages, songs, stories, unique ways of understanding the world. When an elder dies, a library burns. During the colonial era, entire libraries were bulldozed. The education system played a huge role in this. Schools taught African children the history of Europe, but not the history of Africa. They learnt about Napoleon, but not about Shaka Zulu. This created a disconnect from their own identity and heritage, a feeling of being adrift without an anchor in their own past. Recovering and celebrating these lost and suppressed cultures is a vital part of the healing process. The political systems left behind were also deeply flawed, centralized, authoritarian machines handed to new elites. Now, after all this, it would be easy to feel hopeless. It's a heavy story. But to see Africa only through the lens of its colonial scars is to miss the most exciting part of the story, what is happening right now. The continent is not a victim, it is a survivor, and it is rising. The spirit of innovation, resilience, community that existed long before the colonizers arrived was never extinguished. It just went underground, waiting for the sun to return. And today, that sun is shining brighter than it has in a very long time. There is a new energy, a new confidence, a new determination to write our own story. The future is being built by young people. Across the continent, a new generation is emerging that is more connected, more educated, more impatient for change than ever before. They are entrepreneurs creating tech hubs in Nairobi and Lagos, turning Africa into a leader in mobile innovation. They are artists and filmmakers in Accra and Dakar, telling uniquely African stories to a global audience. One of the most powerful movements is the push for greater integration. The African Continental Free Trade Area, for example, is a monumental project aimed at breaking down the old colonial trade barriers. It's an attempt to finally connect the spokes and build a strong African hub. It is Africa looking inward, creating a single market where goods, services, and people can move freely. This is a political and psychological project, chains breaking, communities rebuilding. The work is hard and the road is long, but for the first time in a long time, the map of the future is being drawn by African hands. And that is a story of hope. Comment Africa #1. Like, share, subscribe, and follow for more.